My name is Ross Kelly, I'm a doctor. I'm actually training as a GP, which has kind of given me a kind of a good background in lots of different areas of medicine, including emergency, obstetrics and gynecology, psychiatry, general medicine. And it gives a lot of experience towards things, but I suppose as a starting off thing that I always think when a patient is in front of me, that their beliefs and their attitudes is one of the most important things that I have to take into account when dealing with a patient. And currently in Ireland, you're stripped of that. You're by the way that our legislative and constitutional setup is there. I want to talk briefly about a couple of things. The main things I suppose I want to talk about is the medical angle and from the doctor's choice perspective on the legislation that is currently going through the system and our kind of opinions on it. And it's hard not to feel really that the Catholic Church is the main driving force behind how tight the legislation is, and really it is incredibly restrictive and incredibly tight, and how for what we feel really is a paper-ticking exercise that we've been told to legislate for X from various sources, and that is essentially all that's happening without looking at reality. I mean, this all sparked off, and certainly my involvement with Doctors for Choice started off when you had the case of Savita Halpanavar in Galway, and it was shocking to me as a doctor that that type of thing could happen, that someone whose life was in danger, that you weren't able to, or there were question marks over whether or not you could intervene because of a legislative framework and because of the chill factor that existed from the 1861 legislation. And that's hugely problematic. When you have a patient in front of you who is actively dying, you want to do everything that you can to try to save that patient within the context of that patient's beliefs and attitudes. So say you have someone who is a Jehovah's Witness in front of you, is firmly that, and they're hemorrhaging, and they don't want blood. It's hard for you, but you cannot give them blood because that is what that patient wishes. But here you had a case where someone who felt that their life was in danger and repeatedly asked for an abortion in a case of an inevitable miscarriage, but because in an ultrasound scan there was still a heartbeat, nothing could happen. Doctors could not intervene and they could not go along with her wishes, and tragically things went too far and she died. That is not a good situation as a medic to be in, or to prospectively be in. And what's really interesting about when you look at the legislative framework that they're proposing, the first thing they say is an emergency situation, one consultant doctor can make a decision, and that seems in some ways reasonable. But when someone's life is potentially at risk, you're talking two doctors. My understanding of the way that medicine has been going over the decades is towards a patient-centered approach and away from a paternalistic approach. There's no element there of the woman having a say in all of this. And even when you look forward towards suicidality, you're talking three doctors, one of which is an obstetrician. The only thing in my experience of this is when obstetricians come along someone with psychiatric problems, they think to themselves, better get a psychiatrist involved because I do not know how to deal with this. And yet, legislatively, they want an obstetrician to make a comment on someone's suicide risk, which again shows their lack of understanding and just having people hit at from more angles, more doctors seeing these people. But what's important here is what does a woman who is pregnant believe the risk to her health or her life is? What's an acceptable risk for someone? And that will differ from person to person. For someone who this is, at 5 or 10% risk may be entirely acceptable for one person, but may be absolutely not acceptable for another person. And this is in the context of a country where symphysiotomy was a standard practice many years ago, and again supported by the Catholic Church, so women's fertility could keep going to produce children for Mother Ireland. This is the context that this type of attitude continues, that we will tell you what is right for you, for your health and your life. And to me, that's simply not the way modern medicine should work. It continues on when you look at the issue around suicide, because this has been the big problem point for an awful lot of people. And I suppose there's two factors for this. One, it shows a complete lack of understanding of mental health issues, which, to be honest, isn't very surprising in this country in general. But secondly, if you actually look towards the people who are commenting on the evidence out there. So in medicine, there's this idea that you have to have an evidence base for everything. So what we do, you should have evidence for. The problem with issues around suicide and mental health outcomes is that the evidence isn't really there. That there are papers out there, but they're very weak papers. Even the one that was the anti-choice side were brandishing out there by a guy called David Ferguson. Within it, he said himself that you can't really make many conclusions from this. And the reason for that is, I think there was 8 papers in it. There was only 2 reasonably good quality papers in there, and for the most part, they were very poor quality papers. When you analyze lots of papers together in what's called a meta-analysis, it's very difficult if you've got low quality papers to actually make good assumptions from it. So he himself, when the anti-choice side came out and said, this is the paper that says suicide harms women, because that is their preconceived attitude of it, I would say based on a Catholic Church basis. He actually said, no, you can't say that. Off the basis of my research, that isn't the case. But what's interesting is when it does come to issues around suicide, it's a very complex idea. So they tell us that abortion is not a treatment for suicide. Well, no one treats suicide. You treat suicidal risk. You treat suicidal ideation. And it's a multifactorial thing. There are biological factors, there are psychological factors, and there are, of course, societal factors to all of these things. And people who find themselves in a crisis, pregnancy, that may be the thing that is making them suicidal. And we feel at this point that when you have a psychiatrist involved there with the patient, they can make the decision which is best for that patient. So for example, if that patient is staunchly against abortion, it's not going to help them from a mental health perspective to go forward and have an abortion in all likelihood. But that's the decision that should be made by the doctor and the patient and not dictated downwards. And why, when a woman is suicidal, do we legislatively say, well, first, most likely they're going to go to their GP, because that's the primary contact, and certainly in early stages of pregnancy, that's the primary contact in Ireland. Then you're going to go forward to a panel of 2 psychiatrists and an obstetrician who doesn't know anything about psychiatry. So that's a completely pointless addition to the panel. And if they say no, well then you're adding another 3 doctors on top of it. So minimum 7 doctors for a woman who's in a vulnerable situation. I mean, come on, where's the common sense in that? That's crazy. Where was I next? Okay, the next thing I suppose, there's 2 things I want to talk about just very briefly because I'm running out of time. This next thing, again, there's the issue around fetal abnormality, which to me is an interesting one. So you've got a situation here where, say, a fetus is anencephaly, so will not survive outside the womb. And yet these groups are again saying no. And this again leads into mental health stuff for me, because societal impact and influence is a major part of mental health for people. When you have the Catholic Church telling you that you're evil and that you're sinful for having an abortion, what does that do to you? When you're having people constantly telling you that this is a taboo thing, when you're forced to leave your country to have an abortion, particularly for women, with the case of fetal abnormality, where that is a wanted child, what does that do to your mental health? These groups out there claim to be protecting and interested in women when actually they're just hurting people at a mental health basis. And this again for me undermines any arguments they make about mental health. Lastly, they talk about floodgates. Women in Ireland, lots and lots of women in Ireland have had and will have abortion, those who can travel. And the big problem at this from a medical side of things, and again it's where the influence of this for me is majorly problematic, any medical procedure needs follow-up care, whether physical, psychological, contraceptive counselling, and these kind of things. And what often happens, first of all, because the government is telling you that if you did that in this country, it's a 14-year criminal sentence, again it adds to people will not come forward. People who buy pills over the internet will not come forward if they have problems for fear. That's the kind of thing that's putting women's health at risk. The reality of this is that women are having abortions in this country, and from the medical side of things, the safest and best way of ensuring that these women are protected is done through Irish doctors. That we can have a talk to these people beforehand to ensure that this is the right choice for them. And that's the basis of informed consent, keeping their attitudes in check, or understanding where they come from and their attitudes. That when they do have an abortion, that we can follow them up appropriately, ensure they don't have problems either psychological or physical. And that's how you ensure it's safe and accessible. And ultimately, the Catholic Church is the main driver behind trying to restrict abortion. If they talk about faith, if they had faith in their followers, well, what's the worry? Thanks very much.